All right, we are going to be working on skill 4. We're going to factor trinomials. Trinomials are, you can't do it by grouping because there's only 3 terms. We always look for a GCF first, so those 2 things still happen first. But we're just going to kind of go through 2 examples together where the leading coefficient is 1 of the trinomial. So here's a trinomial, leading coefficient is 1. That means that there's just 1 and then an x squared. Okay, all trinomials will be of this form where it's ax squared plus bx plus c. And this trinomial, all trinomials will factor into 2 binomials. Okay, that's the fundamental theorem of, well, part of the fundamental theorem of algebra is that every equation can be factored and solved. All right, so how do we do this? Well, what we need to remember is when we have a binomial, that means you have 2 terms, right? So I'm just going to put a plus sign in between and some blanks, okay? And remember that these are the same thing, just written differently. So if I want to get this back out from the factored, I would double distribute, right? And then combine like terms, and I should get back out this trinomial. All right, so let's see where we would get an x squared from. That's our first term, so that would come from the first times the first. Okay, so these 2 things, when multiplied, should give you your first term. So what we do is we factor them, right? X squared can be factored into x and x. So x times x gives you x squared. All right, now if I continue distributing, right, and I do x times this guy here, and x times this guy here, that would sum up to our middle term. And I'll get to that in just a second. But how do I get the 20? I get the 20 by taking the last term times the last term. This is my last term, so it's going to be a constant times a constant. So we think about all of the factors of 20. 2 and 10, 4 and 5, 1 and 20, right? And these are all possible things that could go in those blanks. So I can put a 4 and a 5, right? And then when I check it, 4 times 5 is 20, good. So now I'm going to try and get this negative 12, and I do a 4 times x, and an x times 5, and when I add those, I get 9x, but what I really was hoping to get, I was really hoping to get a negative 20, okay? So what we say is we go back to the drawing board, all right? So those were the wrong choices. Now I want you to, off to the sides, you'll kind of write down a list of all the possibilities to make negative 12. Now it's a negative, and this is a positive. So what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up multiplying 2 negative values together. So negative 4 and negative 5. We know that those 2 didn't work. So we go to the next ones. How about negative 2 and negative 10? So I want to put a negative 2 and a negative 10, or a negative 10 and a negative 2. Order doesn't matter. These are the next 2 I'm trying, and what I'm hoping to get is when I multiply these 2 and these 2, I'm hoping to get them to add to negative 12. And when I add these, notice I get negative 12x. And that is exactly the middle term. So I know that I chose the correct factors. So how do I word this in a way that makes sense? Where did we get the first two terms from? We got the first 2 terms from breaking this the leading coefficient up. So those all came together, right? And then to get the second term, I did multiples of the last number, the constant in this case. All right, and then how do we check to make sure I chose the right values for this place? I multiply the inside two and the outside two, and I add them up. And if they add up to the middle term, I know I did it right. So let's take a look at the next example. Okay, I set up the framework. Okay, these are gonna, this trinomial is gonna factor into two binomials. All right, again, that breaks up and goes into the first blank, right? So an x and an x. Next, I need multiples of -42. Multiples of -42. What do I want them to do? Well, it's a negative, so one of them is going to be negatives, one of them is going to be positive. I want the bigger number to be negative. Why? Because I want it to add up to -1x. So we start with any random factors, right? -42 and 1. Then we cruise on down to -21 and 2. And we keep going until we find a pair that adds up to -1. Now obviously I want these numbers to be closer, so I'm going to go ahead and pick two numbers that I know add up multiple to 42 that are really close. Whoopsies. So those two numbers, when multiplied, give you -42, and when I add them, they add to -1. And that's exactly what I wanted, because this is a -1. So I know I can put -7 here and 6 here. Remember, when I multiply those two, they multiply to the -42. When I go to check, right, I add these up, I get -1x, and that is my middle term. So that is my factored trinomial. Now let's take a look at factoring a trinomial where the leading coefficient is not 1. All right, so here, number 5, we have the leading coefficient is 2. I still set it up the same way, right? I still have a binomial and a binomial. And this first term, it still divides up and goes into those spots. So what are two factors of 2x squared? Well, 2x times x. So that's still normal. All right, and then the last term, this is still the same. This term still breaks up and goes in here. But when the leading coefficient is 2, it's more of a guessing game, right? Because no longer do these two multiples have to add up to 9, right? I'm going to take 2 and 5. I'm going to put them in here. I'm just going to put them in any old way, okay? And now I'm going to check to see if I get 9x. So 2 times x and 5 times 2x. And I add these up and I get 12x. That's not exactly 9x. So I probably need to play around with this a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try maybe putting the 5 here and the 2 here. And we'll see what happens there. When I add this up, I get 9x, and that is exactly what I wanted. There's my 9x, so I know that the 5 here and the 2 here are exactly what I needed. So let's try another one. This is a guessing game, right? And the more you practice, the better you're going to get at it, where you won't have to guess so much, okay? So here we go. This first term still breaks up. So we get a 3x and an x. My last term still breaks up into the last spots, right? And it's a negative, so I'm going to have either a -4 and +1, or a -1 and a +4, or a -2 and a +2. All right, so I am going to just pick the first one. I'm going to put a -4 here and a 1 here. It may or may not work. When I go to check it, I get -4x, and here I get a +3x. When I add these up, I get a -x, and I picked correctly, so I don't need to erase anything because that matches the middle term. All right, let's do one more together. Actually, let's pause there and we'll do more in class, okay?